He then praised the game for its insightful and witty commentary into the nature of video game structure and its examination of structural narrative tropes.
I know I'm on record as being sick of games about games. This is still largely true, though if we have to explore the topic, I'd prefer more Spec Opses and Saints Row 4s and fewer Assassin's Creeds and Far Cry 3s.
I sunk your battleship! Are you kidding me?
I get it. It's a tropical vacation where you indulge in ultra-violence. Your social commentary is duly noted. But while I'm tired of the trend overall, there's one game I knew I'd let slide on the issue. Galactic Cafe's The Stanley Parable. This is largely due to the fact that the game's a remake of the 2011 Half-Life 2 mod of the same name, which means that it's not only technically one of the first games to engage in the slightly navel-gazing trend of critiquing games using games, but it's also one of the most incisive games dealing with the subject, looking not at themes like violence, but at the very structure of games and how they're used to convey meaning. It's sort of like Ernest Adams by way of Eric Wolpaw as narrated by Stephen Fry. Surely some of you got that. Unfortunately, the Stanley Parable has proven itself difficult to write about. Normally when I talk about games, I tend to approach it from one of two general directions. A narrative-focused reading that looks at the plot structure, characters, dramatic arcs, and that sort of thing, and a play-focused reading that looks at mechanical systems and how they interact with one another. Then I try to reconcile the two into a cohesive whole, and 1 month later, a stork delivers an Errant Signal episode. Yay! But that doesn't really work for the Stanley Parable. Depending on your choices in the game, there are so many winding plot branches that have little to nothing to do with each other that a traditional narrativist reading is all but impossible. And the game's systems consist of little more than simple binary choices scattered throughout the environment, so a systems-based reading isn't very interesting unto itself. And because the choices drive the direction of the plot, because the plot is all about commenting on the results of those choices, there's no real looking at either in a vacuum. So the old methodology really isn't going to work here. But in an effort to give at least some structure to this episode, I'm going to attempt to go over my short list of themes and ideas the game seems to at least toy with or be interested in. The Stanley Parable seems to have a lot of disdain for traditional win states, or at least how they're used as a carrot to guide player behavior in linear, narrative-driven games. The first indicator of this are the achievements, which seem designed to explicitly force players to do things just to get them. One is toggleable off and on, depending on an option in the game's settings. Some have absurd requirements, like playing the game for an entire Tuesday, and one, knock on door 435 times, actually prompts the narrator to dissect what actions are truly worthy of being called an achievement.
Are you really just doing this for the achievement? Click a door 5 times. Is that all that you think an achievement is worth? No. I can't just give these merits away for such little effort.
Finish it off, Stanley! 5 clicks on door 430! Yes! We did it!
Oh, wow. That felt amazing. Just think, only a few minutes ago you believed an achievement was worth 5 little clicks. Really now? What were you thinking?
There's even an unachievable achievement that seems to unlock on random level loads solely to get under the skin of completionists driven by extrinsic motivation more than the joy of the game. But the one thing they all have in common is that they're either activities you're going to do without the achievements to motivate you, like get the freedom ending or boot the game up more than once, or they're crazy things you'll only do because the achievement asked you to. The point being that in a narrative game, achievements are either tied to the plot and you're going to get them one way or another, or they're tied to a game's systems and therefore distract from the core experience. I mean, I have to assume that carrying a garden gnome through all of Half-Life 2 Episode 2 took away from the gravitas of the proceedings at least a little bit.
Ah! Oh my god!
But the notion of a narrative-based experience being winnable is mocked a number of times in the game itself, too, most notably during the nuclear detonation ending. The quote's a bit on the long side, but I think it's worth listening to.
I mean, look at you. Running from button to button, screen to screen, clicking on every little thing in this room. These numbered buttons, no, these colored ones, or maybe this big red button, or this door. Everything, anything, something here will save me. Why would you think that, Stanley? That this video game can be beaten? Won? Solved? Do you have any idea what your purpose in this place is? Stanley, you're in for quite a disappointment.
We presuppose that games have a win state, that the point is for them to be won. The Stanley Parable questions if that's true, and asks if our attempts to always save the day or get out of trouble stem from a relentless optimism, or if they're simply a Pavlovian response to decades of games that presuppose the end of the story has to be a victory condition. And really, what's the point of calling the end of a story a win state? That equates the end of the story with victory, that you vanquished the bad guy and won the day, but not all stories are like that. In fact, arguably most stories aren't like that. The Stanley Parable indulges itself in tragic, humorous, introspective, and absurdist endings, and while they're all meaningful, most if not all of them could hardly be called victories.
My God, is this really how much you dislike my game? That you'll throw yourself from this platform over and over to be rid of it? You are literally willing to kill yourself to keep me from being happy. Am I reading the situation correctly?
Do you really win when you finish Spec Ops: The Line? Heck, games like Dwarf Fortress or roguelikes are based on the very idea that losing more often results in a better story than victory. Linear games tend to instead invalidate their lose states by suggesting that the only true outcome is the one where the player quote-unquote wins. The Stanley Parable, with all of its endings, asks why a single victory state should be the only canon. The freedom ending is the ending you get an achievement for, and it fills the narrator's grand vision, but it's hardly the only legitimate ending to the game. In fact, the game seems acutely aware that all of its possibilities are canon, despite the fact that it presents itself as a game that wants to tell a singular tale at the narrator's behest. So why should the only canonical ending of Half-Life be the one where the Citadel blows up and the good guys win, and not the tragic story of how Gordon Freeman was shot to death by Combine guards? Or even just the tragic story of how Gordon Freeman tripped and fell off the bridge? There are several reasons that the loading screen on the Stanley Parable has "the end is never the end is never the end is never the end" written across it, and one of them is because all potentialities in the system are valid. No ending is truly final. There is no wrong ending, there is no Prince of Persia style, "and then I died. Wait, no, I'm remembering it wrong." If the Stanley Parable had a true win state, a singular set of choices you could make to get the quote-unquote canonical ending, a way the game could be formally beaten, it would invalidate the rest of the possibility space of the game with one single canonical way to play. But because the game embraces its multiple endings and because the game mocks the idea of it being winnable at all, the game's critical of approaches that use shallow incentives like win states to get players to disregard systemic possibilities that a linear narrative can't handle.
Well, do you know what? Since I've completely forgotten what we were supposed to be doing, how about this? You win! Congratulations! I know you put in a lot of hard work, and it really paid off, so good job.
The Stanley Parable also has more than a passing fancy in the nature of choice and what it means for free will in games. The whole game's built on choice, after all, with the set piece of the whole game being a room with 2 doors to choose from. But despite being a game where the decisions of the player guide the plot, the Stanley Parable seems somewhat ambivalent about the nature of choice in games as a substantive, meaningful act on the part of the player. For example, the confusion ending opens by asking about the nature of choice in the real world.
Choice. It's the best part of being a real person. Most medical professionals recommend making at least 8 choices per day. Do you make more than 8? Less? And finally, if you begin to wonder if your choices are actually meaningful and whether you'll ever make a significant contribution to the world, just remember that in the vast infiniteness of space, your thoughts and problems are materially insignificant.
While it's done in a tongue-in-cheek way, it serves to deconstruct the notion of choices as discrete, or even necessarily meaningful acts, the way we present them in video games. In real life, the majority of choices are things like, do I want to have pizza or sandwiches for dinner, or what should I wear today? They're decisions of little consequence made with little thought. We don't count the decisions we make one at a time, or try to demand that they have a demonstrable and immediate impact on the world around us. But in games, choices are often framed as these big, important decisions that are expected to have lasting ramifications of extreme good or extreme evil, and the more of them the game has, the better. And it puts this notion of player power and player choice on a pedestal that it doesn't necessarily deserve. And for a game about choice, it's notable that Stanley himself is often referred to as not having true freedom of will. In one ending, it's because of the mind control device, which he can only turn off by, ironically, blindly following the narrator's instructions without question. In another, it's because he's a drone worker, trying to escape from the monotony of his reality, inventing the illusion of choice where none would otherwise exist. In yet another, it's because he's a fictional character who can't have choice because someone else is writing his future. And in yet another, his decision-making ability stems entirely from the player, and with the player removed, he becomes incapable of any action at all. Stanley is doomed to forever desire freedom and autonomy, but never truly achieve it. The museum ending has a second narrator talk about this idea directly to the player.
When every path you can walk has been created for you long in advance, death becomes meaningless, making life the same. Do you see now? Do you see that Stanley was already dead from the moment he hit start?
True freedom doesn't exist for Stanley. It can't exist for Stanley, because even when he defies the narrator, he's still operating within the confines of the game's structure. Every path of perceived defiance is really just another pre-planned route by Galactic Cafe, and as the player you're no more free for following those faux protestations than Stanley is when he listens to the narrator to shut off the mind control device. The woman narrator goes so far as to say that the only true choice the game offers is to quit playing it.
You can stop the program before they both fail. Push escape and press quit. There's no other way to beat this game. As long as you move forward, you'll be walking someone else's path. Stop now and it'll be your only true choice.
Note that the game doesn't reject the notion of choice outright, but rather the idea that choice in games is something owned wholly by the player, that choice gives players any true free will or power. The idea that choice has to be meaningful to the player is also mocked in the game's demo.
These buttons are meant to convey the meaning of choice and the impact of the decisions you make. After all, choices carry tremendous meaning and consequence. Didn't you know that? How fascinating. Did you know that 94% of all people who select that particular button are sexual predators?
And the promotional video for the game pokes fun at the other extreme, where choice really is unlimited and wholly in the hands of the player.
In this scenario, the player has just infused a bicycle with the soul of his great-great-great-uncle Hermophrides. From this point, he might use Hermophrides' ethereal presence to detect nearby mineral deposits, or perhaps he might train the bicycle in the art of undoing temporal paradoxes. It seems that the player has chosen to use the haunted bicycle to deceive townsfolk as a part of his snake oil salesman ruse. How bold.
Complete, boundless freedom like the bike scene doesn't exist, can't exist, in any game. Players in game systems aren't free, they're exploring a text with rules, put there intentionally by an author. The Stanley Parable posits that thinking a player's choices signify free will in a game is like thinking fictional characters have free will over their own actions when the whole text is already written out in front of them. Your choices in games aren't decisive in nature, but instead they're exploratory. You're not making lasting decisions, but you're choosing a branch of possibility space to examine. You don't have the freedom of choice, you have the walls and rules of mechanics that give shape and meaning to the game even as they confine you. Which leads me to the next point I think the game touches on. Games are usually framed as power fantasies in the sense that you shoot dudes with big guns or hit monsters with giant swords, but there's another angle to the power fantasy that isn't about raw physical strength that we don't talk about as much, the idea that the player matters. Games are, in a lot of ways, narcissistic and usually focus the narrative squarely on the player out of necessity. The Stanley Parable takes this idea and frames it as an escape from day-to-day monotony, a way to feel grand and important despite being trapped in a system where you're truly impotent. I mean, just so we're clear, the game's about a man who stands in front of a computer and pushes buttons in an order the machine tells him to, while under the influence of a system of control put in place by people he's never met. His boss, who has an ostentatious office, seems to be in on the whole mind control plot, and there are cutesy scribbles about his absolute power over the company in the bathroom. It's not exactly a subtle condemnation of the modern dead-end office job and how video games can exist as an indulgent but ultimately empty escapist fantasy that distracts them from that reality. The apartment ending actually touches on this directly.
Stanley is quite a boring fellow. He has a job that demands nothing of him, and every button that he pushes is a reminder of the inconsequential nature of his existence. Now he's pushing a button. Now he's eating lunch. Now he's going home. Now he's coming back to work. One might even feel sorry for him, except that he's chosen this life. He imagined that he came to two open doors and that he could go through either. At last, choice. It barely even mattered what lay behind each door. The mere thought that his decisions would mean something was almost too wonderful to behold.
This is where Stanley being a stand-in for the player becomes somewhat interesting, though, because the game isn't really making that point in the abstract. It's making that point about us, the players. Every time we click our mouse buttons, the game makes keyboard noises like we're typing away at our office at work. We're the ones who are hitting the keys in response to the narrator's demands, just as Stanley hits keys based on what his computer tells him. The Stanley Parable may be Stanley's escape from the monotony of his job, but video games in general are our collective way of escaping, of trying to find importance and empowerment in a system that's comfortable leaving us behind. It's a game that sees its peers as opiates providing escapism rather than prompting real change, and that's sort of sobering. Stanley's sad, endless, and futile search for meaning and hope becomes all the darker when it's seen as a metaphor for the desperation of working-class people. Escaping into a fantasy where actions feel meaningful but are ultimately confined to a digital fiction, we slowly realize that even in there, true choice is an illusion. Also, this is a bit off topic, but in a certain sense the game seems to have a lot of the same philosophical undertones as The Matrix. Lowly desk worker slowly realizes he's been lied to about his reality, and then gets talked down to by a guy with grand designs, and has to make a choice between two doors while meditating on free will and predetermination. It's worth a thought. The tension between the interests of the player and the interests of the designer is the core conflict throughout the game. Stanley, a stand-in for the player, wants freedom and control above all else. The narrator is effectively a stand-in for game developers. He wishes to tell his story, to see his brilliant vision of events come to pass in the most exciting and emotionally impactful way possible, regardless of how Stanley or the player feel about it. Now, the game's got a mean postmodernist streak, and sometimes these metaphors fall apart. The narrator sometimes actually fights with the true game designers, and sometimes the player is explicitly framed as separate from Stanley. But generally speaking, the player is Stanley and the narrator is the game designer. To play the Stanley Parable is to search for a happy medium between the two, to find a place where Stanley and the player have their freedom, and a place where the narrator and the developer's stories can be told, all in one beautiful and affecting cohesive experience. And the paradox of the Stanley Parable, the Stanley Paradox if you like, is that the game simultaneously rejects and exemplifies this notion. In every ending of the game, in every single one, someone gives up something to the other. There are endings where the narrator exerts authoritarian control, often in cruel ways, and there are endings where Stanley, or even the player is separate from Stanley, abandon or destroy the narrator's vision. But there is no ending with a happy medium between the two. The great irony being, of course, that the game, the Stanley Parable, is itself a wonderful merger of the author's intent and vision clearly coming through while also giving players the possibility space to explore rather than forcing them down one true path. What does that mean? Well, I take it as a rejection of the narrator's approach more than anything. Galactic Cafe have a vision of a possibility space where any one of a myriad of outcomes are equally valid, and when taken into context with each other, form the cohesive whole that is the Stanley Parable. In contrast, the narrator has his singular vision with a linear narrative, his beloved and much searched for story. His addiction to this singular story, this one linear way things can turn out, is so steadfast that he actually introduces a literal line to follow in order to assure the player will arrive there undeterred. Where Galactic Cafe sees sculpting a possibility space as a way of giving meaning to games, the narrator rejects the idea of possibility space as doing nothing more but detracting from his tale. It's no accident that the only real mechanic in the game, these binary choices, basically stops being a mechanic when you follow his instructions. The narrator literally hasn't planned for any interaction to influence his story. Like I said, the game is a dense text full of differing ideas, and some come through stronger than others. Really, it's almost too dense, coming across as a diffuse project that invokes everything from postmodern deconstructions of player characters through to vague grumblings about the plight of middle-class office workers to tongue-in-cheek meditations on free will. I think that might be why the general takeaway is, yeah, it makes fun of video game tropes and stuff. You have to spend a lot of time picking at the parts to make it a cohesive whole, and even then it's pretty scattershot in its approach. It's almost too clever for its own good, running off on thematic tangents of interest and leaving a lot of the core undeveloped. Still, it's a game with no shortage of ideas, and it's presented in a hilarious and memorable way. Just don't be surprised if it takes you a while and several playthroughs to start seeing how some of these disparate threads and ideas correlate. After all, Stanley's still in there, still searching in vain for the meaning and freedom he'll never find.
There once was a man named Stanley, who people considered so manly. But the truth must be told, he was not very old, and was quite particularly gangly. What Stanley liked most was buttons. He pushed them like some kind of glutton,